Back to you, John. M0J8 from K0QR.
Hi, I'm Neil, W0VLZ. Today I'd like to give you a little tour of my shack. Ham radio has a lot of different facets of interest. Mine happens to be radio technology and the way it has changed over the years. For me, it is neat to be able to play with radios from different years of technology so that I can see for myself the impact of design changes. To do this, I have 10 operating positions set up here in my basement so that I can easily get on the air with different transmitters and receivers. I can see, hear, and feel what it was like to be on the air 50 to 100 years ago. In the early days of ham radio, many of the rigs were homebrew or home built. Part of my interest includes constructing gear using plans from the early days of ham radio. You'll see several examples of vintage homebrew scattered around in my shack. The first thing that you see coming into my basement ham shack is the 1929 position. Like in the 20s, most of the gear is homebrew. Makes for interesting usage. But from here, let's move on and take a look at the rest of the shack. Stepping into the main part of my ham shack, I have 9 more operating positions set up. They run the gamut from mid-50s sort of homebrew, Collins equipment, quite a good library of QST magazines. You see they're hardbound in this case. Then a 1970 vintage Drake equipment, some Heathkit equipment that a novice might use, and then just swinging around all several different things I can put on here depending on my mood, including a KX3 with the pan adapter. Right behind it is a mid-50s sort of average technology sort of novice gear. Starting in the 50s, we had the novice class license. Prior to that, in the 40s, you still had beginners, but they still homebrewed their own gear. So samples of that is in the main part of my shack. Some of the higher class gear that hams might have bought in the mid-30s and into the late 30s. Of course, homebrew was still a big thing. Hams tended to build their own equipment. It was cheaper that way when there was a lot of hand wiring involved in a piece of commercial gear. And so I have some examples of that here too. So anyway, 10 operating positions. I have one more open down here in the basement, and operating position number 12 is up is a piece of coax running up to the main level of the house in case I ever want to operate from the dining room. So that's the station the way it's currently set up, and we can also take a look at some of the details. Let's walk through my shack again, looking at each position in detail. This is my 1929 position. Every year the Antique Wireless Association sponsors the Bruce Kelly 1929 contest. This is where you'll find me for those few days. 20s designed transmitters and tubes are required. You see here 3 transmitters that I built from old QST articles, along with 3 homebrew receivers and a couple of national shortwave receivers. The Drake receiver is a backup for use if bad band conditions. Building and using this 1929 gear is quite an exercise. I made many contacts using these three transmitters. Finding parts and building a vintage gear is really fun. Using it gives me an appreciation for where ham radio was only 40 years before I was first on the air. This is my 1934 position. It includes the receiver on the right, which is a National FBX, and the homebrew transmitter on the left, which uses, well, the transmitter itself uses early 30s tubes. The amplifier, which is the top half that you see, uses tubes that were marketed in 1937, 1938. The FBX on the right was the first national super het receiver that was marketed to hams, and it was a cost-reduced version of the national AGS, or Air Ground System, airport receiver. It uses plug-in coils to change bands, which was pretty common for the early 30s gear. As a cost reduction, the RF stage was sold separately. That's what you see on the right, and it bolted on the side of the case after it was bought. My particular FBX receiver has a crystal filter built into it for selectivity. And you also see, as was common in that vintage gear, it did not have direct frequency readout. It had a scale calibrated from 0 to 150, and you made up your own calibration scale. The transmitter on the left is homebrew, crystal controlled, designed to operate on 80 and 40 using plug-in coils. Uses a fairly common circuit that was showed up in lots of early 30s gear, including even the earliest of the national transmitters. This pair together would have made a coveted station in 1934. This is my 1937 position. By 1937, more hams could afford a high-end receiver, and several companies vied for the honor of selling one. This national HRO series receiver is a good example. It had 2 RF stations and a crystal filter. Band changing, though, was still via plug-in coils. 4 coils per band were ganged together and plugged in as a unit. Frequency reading was still just a 0 to 500 dial without direct frequency readout. But that 0 to 500 dial is a joy to use. The HRO series lasted into the 60s. The Utah Junior transmitter paired with it, with the HRO, is a good example of a kit marketed by a company to sell their transformers and chokes. In the 30s, homebrew, especially for transmitters, was still the normal. So I'm happy to be able to use the Utah Junior with my HRO. Now, all in all, this is a good example of a station for a fairly well-to-do late 30s ham. Next on my parade of radios is more of a 1940 beginner set. It is all homebrew CW and runs only about 15 watts. It uses a minimum of tubes. While not as flashy as the HRO Utah Junior pair, it is still very usable. This is a station that I've used several times in the AWA Link Kendall contest, which gives extra points for pre-1950 equipment. My 1954 position is shared with my KX3. We'll come back to the KX3 later. In 1951, the Novice class was introduced. It offered a great stepping stone to full ham privileges, but it came with operating restrictions that drove low-end radio designs for 20 years. The Johnson Adventure transmitter on the right was designed and marketed for novices, but options such as a VFO and AM modulator give it attractive growth potential. The E.F. Johnson Company was in Washika, just, maybe 100 miles west of Rochester, Minnesota. Paired with the Adventure is a low-end national receiver, an NC57. Here again, options such as a Q multiplier and an S meter could be added to make it more usable by a new novice. These two together could possibly be related a lower to mid-range novice station, something a teenager might own and be proud of. These actually work together to make a pretty good usable station even today. Let's talk about the mid-50s QRP station I built up. I do a lot of QRP or low power operating in the park. This is what I mostly use my KX3 for. But what was QRP in the park like in the 50s? I built this pair using tubes and designs common in the 50s. And it can be powered by flashlight battery combined with common for the time 45 and 90 volt batteries. It works, but it has a lot of personality. It has a regenerative receiver. The transmitter itself is only good for about a watt output. It's crystal controlled, and of course, like most of my radios, it's CW only. But it sounds amazingly good. While a challenge to use, I can see having a day in the park with it. This is my late 50s Cadillac novice station. I've never seen a photo of a novice station with a Collins 75A4, but if one existed, I'm sure it would be coveted coast to coast. The 75A4 came out in 1955 as Collins' flagship receiver. It works great, and it works great as advertised with single kilohertz direct frequency readout, 400 Hertz CW selectivity, variable passband tuning, and a product detector for single sideband. I paired the 75A4 with an ICO 720. This is a model transmitter I had as a novice in 1965. It meets all of the novice requirements and has a little style to go along with that. It's crystal controlled, runs 75 watts, and it had Pi network output. It also has great growth potential, as you can add a VFO to it, an AM modulator, and drive it to up to 90 watts input. So these two together in the late 50s would be quite a station. Let's take a look at this HW16. The classic novice license limited high frequency operating to 80, 40, and 15 meters, CW only, crystal controlled, with a maximum power of 75 watts. The Heathkit company was one that supported novices with a range of equipment tailored to meet these requirements. The HW16 was introduced in 1968 as a complete novice transceiver. At $100 for the kit, it fit into lots of budgets, and with an excellent cost-performance design optimized for the time. Now, this is my late 60s Drake station. You see on the right the Drake R4B, which was introduced in 1968, and on the left the 2NT transmitter, which was introduced in 1966. These two make up my favorite vintage CW station. They are excellent examples of late 60s design that fit the needs of a novice except for the price point. At $560 for the pair, this station prices out at 5 times what a Heathkit HW16 might cost. They make a great pair, but rarely would you find one in a novice or beginner shack. The R4B was more commonly paired with the T4XB for high performance CW and single sideband operation, while the 2NT was marketed with the 2C receiver. But still, the 2NT and 2C combination paired out at more than $360, over 3 times the HW16. Drake made great rigs, but they were usually beyond the pocketbook of a novice. During my novice year, I could only look at catalogs and drool over the great Drake gear. Now, I'm lucky to be able to put this pair on the air. Finally, you see here my KX3, which is my current main or primary station. It has with it the PX3 pan adapter, so I can see other activity on the band. Besides using it here in the shack, I also take it out to the park when it's warmer. During the summer, this is my QRP in the park rig, with a battery, key, and antenna all packed in a shoulder pack with it. I'm ready to get on the air, and it makes a great station. It works fine and has given me 10 years of excellent on-the-air time. When I go for a drive, any roadside rest area can turn into my next ham shack. Well, that's my shack today. As you know, ham radio has a lot of different facets to it. DXing, contesting, rag shoeing, CW, digital, everything. My particular area of interest, as you can see, happens to be tracing technology in ham radio from the late 20s through late 60s, early 70s. Basically, the vacuum tube era. If you have any questions or comments, you can find my email address on QRZ.com by searching for my call, W0 Victor Lima Zulu.